In a letter published in O Globo on the 21st, Professor Denise Rolenberg clarifies that the conclusion I drew from her book Cuba's support for the armed struggle in Brazil, namely, that the joint action of the military in 1964 resulted from Cuban intervention in the guerrilla movement, not the other way around, is mine and not hers. She needn't have said so. A universal convention in the world of ideas holds that whatever one author infers from facts cited by another is entirely the responsibility of the first. But I trust Professor Denise won't be offended if I add that, taking responsibility for the conclusions, I also claim whatever merit they may have. Conversely, and complementarily, the responsibility, and whatever merit there may be, for denying those conclusions against the weight of the facts falls to her. In her book, Professor Denise, immediately after acknowledging that the Cuban government had been participating in revolutionary actions in Brazil since 1961, writes, after 1964, the left tended, and still tends, to construct the memory of its struggle chiefly as one of resistance to the new regime's authoritarianism. However, interpreting the armed struggle as essentially an act of resistance casts a shadow over central aspects of the experience in the conflicts undertaken by leftist social movements in the period prior to 1964. Translated from the peculiar dialect of Brazilian academia, the only one in the world where ambiguity is synonymous with rigor, what does that paragraph mean if not that the Brazilian left, aided by Cuba, had been attempting to seize power through armed means for 3 years before the military coup, and that, after the fact, it began using the new regime as a retroactive pretext to claim it had been forced into violence, reluctantly, tearfully, by the loss of peaceful avenues of struggle? In short, the left lied for nearly 40 years, while the right, the execrable right, was simply telling the truth when it said the 1964 coup was a legitimate reaction to an ongoing revolution that was quite willing to resort to armed violence with clandestine support from a foreign dictatorship. Absolutely nothing in those facts allows one to conclude, as Professor Denise does, that the support the Cuban government gave to guerrillas in Brazil, in 3 distinct moments, cannot explain, and certainly not justify, the military's actions. The very notion that an armed intervention by a foreign state fails to explain or justify an equally armed response by the offended nation is, in itself, so bizarre that it hardly needs refutation. To state it plainly is enough to discredit it on the spot. That this reaction took the form of a military coup and the removal of the sitting government may seem curious, but the explanation, albeit involuntary, comes from Professor Denise herself. She recounts, page 26, that this government, upon seizing concrete evidence of Cuban armed intervention in late 1962, instead of issuing even the most minimal protest to international organizations, as was its plain duty, did what? It hid the evidence and discreetly returned it to an emissary of Fidel Castro. Professor Denise sees nothing particularly anomalous in this presidential act, so much so that, somewhat dazed, she describes it as a mere and routine diplomatic solution. But what president of any country, having in hand evidence of foreign armed intervention, would hide it from his own people and quietly return it to the offending nation, without thereby becoming its accomplice, and therefore guilty of high treason? And why would João Goulart commit such a crime if he weren't more invested in the aggressor's plans than in his duties as head of state? My God! In a country where a president was ousted from office for simple embezzlement, and a senator risks losing his mandate for violating the secrecy of a vote in a minor parliamentary committee, is it really so hard for Professor Denise to grasp the immeasurable gravity of passing a military secret to an aggressive foreign nation? And how can one fail to see in this the partnership of criminal and accomplice in carrying out a single, unified revolutionary strategy? Yes, there were differences between the 1961 guerrilla campaign and the subsequent peaceful rhetoric. But those differences merely reflected the clever alternation and combination of methods, sometimes simultaneous, sometimes sequential, by which communists, in accordance with Stalin's formula of strategic unity through dizzying tactical variation, confound their opponents. Nothing, absolutely nothing, can obscure the continuity of the revolutionary effort that, orchestrated from Havana, has shaken the continent for 4 decades. This continuity is confirmed, albeit involuntarily, as always, by Professor Denise herself, when she admits that after the failed experience of the League's 1961, and once the civil-military dictatorship was established, Cuba redefined its way of supporting the revolution in Brazil. Who could redefine something that hadn't already been defined? By betraying the trust of the nation, João Goulart merely continued, by other means, the guerrilla campaign of 1961, just as the armed struggle after the coup continued Goulart's betrayal. And in turn, 3.5 decades of obfuscation and lies, in classrooms and in newspapers, continued the guerrilla legacy of Marighella and Lamarca, always varying the means to pursue the constant end, the implantation of a communist regime. If more proof of this strategic continuity were needed, it was given by the Foro de São Paulo when it declared itself, under the applause of Lula and Tutti Quanti, the reincarnation of the Comintern, with the stated goal of reclaiming in Latin America what was lost in Eastern Europe, as reported in the official Cuban newspaper Granma, July 5, 1990. It is obvious that Professor Denise, knowing this, couldn't say it outright without risking her job in a university environment neck-deep in sustaining the lie. That's why she spoke in half-truths. It's understandable that she gets irritated when someone translates them into whole truths. As for me, I couldn't care less about the jobs of academics who, for 4 decades, have been paid by the Brazilian state to assist Cuban, Soviet, and Chinese interference in national affairs, whether by means of guerrilla warfare or by covering it up. Every salary these people received was extorted from the victim in payment for a monthly act of betrayal. I'm not saying this is the personal case of Professor Denise, of whom I know nothing. But don't let anyone say I accuse only one side. I have not tired, in this column and elsewhere, of denouncing those who now receive money from American foundations to undermine the foundations of national identity. That many of them also work for Cuba is no surprise. Treason is treason, no matter which foreign power benefits from it. The KGB in Brazil. Anyone who read my article, The Forbidden History, published in the latest issue of Digesto Econômico, must not miss the video Brazil in the espionage archives of the Soviet bloc, which fully confirms the article with primary source documents revealed for the first time in the world. The papers, obtained directly from the archives of the former Czechoslovak secret police, had been kept since the end of the communist regime in the collection of the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes in the Czech Republic, where, with the help of local researchers, they were found by Mauro Abranches, a Brazilian translator living in Poland. Without any political agenda, the video's author refrains from offering opinions about the content of the documents. He simply shows and translates them. But they speak for themselves, and what they say is a devastating indictment of the pseudo-historiography, sectarian and deceitful, that for decades has poisoned Brazilian minds with a unilateral, distorted version of 60 years of the country's political life. What characterizes this literature, enshrined in publishing houses, in the mainstream media, and in university curricula, as if it were gospel, is the childish fable that everything that happened in Brazilian politics during the 1960s and 70s amounted to a conflict between the agents of an imperialist superpower, armed to the teeth, and, on the other side, a handful of brave, minority patriots, isolated and practically defenseless at the mercy of a tyrannical and repressive regime. When they admit the struggle was part of the Cold War, they still try to give the impression that it was fought between the United States and a few helpless little Brazilians. The major antagonist of the U.S., the USSR, vanishes completely from view, suggesting that the communist threat at the time was either a paranoid right-wing delusion or just a shabby excuse used by the coup plotters to overthrow a democratically elected government. Thousands of books, reports, academic theses, and TV specials have been painstakingly written and produced to defend this version, which rests, then as now, on 2 essential pillars. A. The servile and obstinate repetition of whatever the Soviet secret services ordered to be said. B. The systematic concealment of the KGB's operations and those of its Czech partners in Brazil. Complementing this, the role of the U.S. in shaping events appears monstrously inflated, despite the fact that at the time, not even the KGB's own chief in Brazil, Ladislav Bittman, knew of a single CIA agent stationed in the country. And to this day, not a single verifiable name of any American spy involved in planning the 1964 coup has ever surfaced. Not even one. In 1985, Bittman published his memoir, The KGB and Soviet Disinformation, in which he confessed that the entire story of American involvement in the ousting of Joao Goulart had been fabricated by his subordinates, based entirely on forged documents. Operation Thomas Mann, or Operation Toro, as its creators called it, dictated the terms in which the story of the coup should be written. Even journalists of the stature of Otto Maria Karpos helped to sell this version to the public. And still today, the will of Moscow is followed unquestioningly by thousands of journalists, historians, and professors in this country. There may be no comparable example in world history of such long-lasting residual loyalty to the directives of a regime that no longer exists. Since 2001, I have insisted that interviewing Bittman should be the basic duty of any historian or journalist who honestly wished to report the events of 1964. But of course, I was always met with condescending silence. The idea of investigating more thoroughly the KGB's penetration into Brazil through Soviet archives was treated almost as a crime against the nation. But now, it's no longer just the word of a retired secret agent or the ranting of a lone columnist. These are hundreds of pages from an official agreement signed in the early 1960s between the KGB and the Czech Secret Service, STB, for operations in the Third World, including Brazil. The conclusion is inescapable. While American intelligence services were largely absent from Brazil's high-level affairs, almost vaporously so, the KGB STB network was deeply infiltrated and active at every level of power, including ministries, state-owned companies, the armed forces, scientific and educational institutions, and, of course, the mainstream media. The communist threat was never a paranoid hallucination or a conspiracy theory, but rather an intrusive and overwhelming presence, the most serious blow ever struck against Brazil's national sovereignty. The documents include not only strategic plans, but also a detailed record of ongoing operations, with the names of infiltrated entities, the actions carried out in each, and, most importantly, the identities of the agents responsible. Professor Abranches, quite rightly, requests that these names not yet be made public, since it is still impossible to distinguish, at this early stage, which individuals were professional agents and which were coerced into collaboration through blackmail or threats. I will therefore refrain from commenting on those whose names I recognized immediately when they appeared on screen. I will say only this. Many of those longtime servants of a genocidal foreign power are still around today, shining in the press and in academia, with the most respectable faces imaginable, deceiving the Brazilian public daily. There is no such thing as an ex-KGB agent. Vladimir Putin.